So hello everyone and welcome to the last Max Weber lecture of this academic year. We are super happy to have Sheilagh Ogilvie with us from Oxford, who's going to be talking about a forthcoming book that she has on controlling contagion. I just learned that we are the first audience who will be hearing about this book and this presentation, so that's extra a point for extra blandness for us to hear something very new. So we'll wait for Raffaele Danna, who will be introducing our speaker in more detail. So Raffaele, please.
Yeah, sorry, we were trying to address some organizational bug. I am Raffaele Danna. I'm one of the Max Weber Fellows here in history, and I have the task to introduce Sheilagh Ogilvie here for you tonight. And I have a bunch of notes to do this because Sheilagh's profile is quite frankly intimidating, and it's just not possible to remember everything that she's done so far. She is the Sheilagh Professor of Economic History at All Souls College in Oxford, which is one of the most prestigious positions in economic history in the world, quite frankly. And prior to that, she has taught for over 30 years at the Faculty of Economics at the University of Cambridge. Just some of her affiliations: she's a fellow of the British Academy, the Academy of Social Sciences, the Center for Economic Policy Research, and CESIFO. She is originally from Canada, as she likes to remind people currently, but she has studied at the University of St. Andrews, in Cambridge, and in Chicago. So she's been around quite a lot, and she's been a research fellow at Trinity College in Cambridge. In terms of books, just a few titles. The last book was titled The European Guilds and Economic Analysis, which was published by Princeton University Press in 2019. Previous title is Institutions and European Trade, Merchant Guilds from the year 1000 to 1800 by Cambridge University Press. She has published also A Bitter Living, Women, Markets and Social Capital in Early Modern Germany, published by Oxford University Press. She has an extensive list of papers on broad topics. I will list just a few to give you a sense of the scope: serfdom, human capital, state capacity, epidemic disease, as we will hear tonight, guilds, merchants, communities, the family, gender, consumption, finance, proto-industry, historical demography, childhood, and social capital. I use one of her quotes to introduce and to describe herself. She says, "I explore the lives of ordinary people in the past and try to explain how poor economies get richer and improve human well-being. I am particularly interested in how social institutions, which are the formal and informal constraints on economic activity, shaped economic development in Europe between the Middle Ages and the present day." And finally, I speak from experience and from several other independent sources in saying that Sheilagh is also particularly special in being a scholar who not only does first-rate research, but she's also always very attentive to the people who are around her. She's one of the people who has responded to emails with the greatest, punctuality, and she's very much available and approachable. So really, I encourage you to ask questions and to engage in this conversation with her. So without any further ado, here we have Sheilagh Ogilvie, who will speak about controlling contagion, epidemics, and institutions from the Black Death to COVID. So join me in welcoming Sheilagh here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for the very nice introduction, both from Juho and from Raffaele. I hope that you can hear me and that I don't speak too quickly, because I think the last time I was in Florence, I was speaking at the Datini conference in Prato, and there was simultaneous translation, and the translator came up to me and said, could you just speak a little bit more slowly? So if I start speaking too fast, wave your hands and I will slow down. It is a great pleasure. As Juho was mentioning, this is the first outing for my new book, which is on epidemics and institutions. And it functioned as a commitment device for Princeton University Press, who in a hurry finalized the design of the book cover and finalized some flyers for you, which should be making the rounds here. So I'm very excited to talk about this project. When the pandemic happened, there was a sort of bandwagon effect, and at least a lot of us economists started writing articles about pandemics, and I thought, I'll never do that. I would never jump on that bandwagon. Well, here we are 4 years later, and I didn't just jump on the bandwagon of writing one paper. I ended up writing a whole book. And the reason that I started doing it was that it seemed to me that there were basic pieces of economic reasoning and also basic pieces of historical knowledge that could be put together very productively in thinking about how human societies interact with the biological world. And I thought we have some fantastic economic history on how epidemics affect institutions, but we actually don't have that much on how human societies deal with epidemics. And so I kind of wanted to turn the causation around and say, what can we actually say about how populations of people interact with populations of microbes? Now, basic question of the book was how human populations deal with microbial ones. And one of the questions that especially epidemiologists and medical historian colleagues kept asking me was, well, but isn't it just science and medicine? And I thought, well, I don't know. As a medievalist and early modernist, we didn't have really science and medicine, and what medics in the medieval and the early modern period thought caused disease was really a bit wacko. And so maybe it's not just science and medicine, it's also the whole organization of society. So the question was, is science and medicine, obviously it matters, but is it the only thing that matters? Was one of the basic questions that informed the book. The second question was, what can we learn from just applying basic economic reasoning to the way in which we interact with populations of other species, and in this case, microbes? Are there lessons from history as well? So what does history tell us? How can we bring together, we economic historians, bring together both of our disciplines, basic economic reasoning and what we know about what happened? And is it actually the case that societies differed in the ways that they interacted with disease, epidemic disease? And can societies learn? And I think, congratulations, well done. So we got to the end of slide 2. Can societies learn? Is societal learning actually possible? Very good, thank you, congratulations. So those were the basic questions that I set out to answer or ask in the book. And those are the guiding questions which I want to talk about over the next 40 minutes or so. So the first thing is, what are we actually trying to talk about? And as you'll see on this slide, and I'm really happy that we got the slides here, since the Black Death, and including the Black Death, we've actually had 8 major pandemics over the last 764 years. So that means we've had more than one pandemic per century. In fact, it's about one every 84 years. They weren't evenly distributed, but we had between the Black Death which started in 1346 over in the Black Sea area, and COVID-19, which we all unfortunately experienced in 2020, 8 pandemics, one every 84 years on average. But on top of that, there were many nationwide epidemics that you wouldn't necessarily call a pandemic, one that goes across international boundaries. Although, as we'll see, that's an important thing when we try to think about how human institutions can manage epidemics, is cross-border externalities is one of the really big issues. What kind of institutions are available to us to deal with problems that spill over beyond the reach of either local or national institutions? And then there have been numerous regional and local outbreaks. So we're not just talking about the 8 big pandemics, but we're talking about a lot more. So we had a number of pandemics of bubonic plague, especially in the medieval and the early modern period. And in fact, those of you with a discerning eye for Florentine architecture will have noticed that the picture on the front of my book is actually from Florence in 1630. So Florence between 1630 and 1631 had an absolutely terrible bubonic plague epidemic. And that picture was taken of one of the square in which the Misericordia, which was one of these Catholic lay institutions, so it was a manifestation of the institution of religion, was actually feeding into both social distancing and caring for the people who got bubonic plague. So, and we'll touch on that a little bit later on. So, so there have been a couple of pandemics of bubonic plague. Then there was, of course, the Columbian Exchange, in which, and I think calling it the exchange is it was unequal exchange, let us say, because Europeans got syphilis, but Central and South America got everything else that we had. So plague, measles, smallpox especially, all sorts of fevers of various sorts that we're still trying to diagnose today. And the mortality effects were actually even worse than they had been in Europe a couple of centuries earlier with the Black Death. So the Columbian Exchange, the exchange of pathogens between the New World and the Old, was a gigantic series of pandemics, which mainly afflicted the recipient economies in the Americas. There was then ongoing smallpox. In fact, I've kind of called it 1670 to 1977, but actually that was when smallpox began to overtake plague in Europe as the major source of pandemics, but it had been raging in Europe, in Asia for a long time, which was actually quite good for Asia because Asia had developed, China especially, and India had developed a pre-vaccination form of immunization, which is an example of a piece of intellectual learning that Europe received either willingly or unwillingly from the Middle East and China and India at the beginning of the 18th century, but they had known about it for centuries. In fact, the very earliest definite testimony of this pre-vaccination form of immunization, which was called variolation, comes from mid-16th century China, but there's indications that it had existed long before. So there was smallpox, which in Europe started in the 17th century, but goes back a long way. There were a series of cholera pandemics from 1817 onwards, because when cholera stopped just being an endemic disease in northern India and moved out into the rest of the world, and cholera pandemics still going on. There was a third plague pandemic, which took place in the late 19th and early 20th century, again afflicting, not afflicting Europe, but so much, but but other parts of the world. There was the Spanish flu in 1918 to 19, which was what a lot of us economists started analyzing as soon as COVID happened. And then finally, there was COVID-19 in 2020. So there are all of these examples of huge encounters between human populations and microbial ones. And the question is, what was it? Is it just a biological question? Is it just a scientific and medical question? Or is there something that we as social scientists can say something about? Well, I think you've deduced by now that my answer in the book is yes, it is something that we as social scientists can say something about if we bring together the insights of different social sciences. But I think the naive view is still, well, what really matters is that epidemics have been brought under control, and they were brought under control mainly from the late 19th century onwards via scientific medicine, via the understanding that microbes existed, that there were ways of dealing with them, that you could develop antibiotics, that you could develop antivirals, although that only started in the 1920s, and that really that was the only way in which we brought these gigantic epidemics under control, or as in 2020, didn't immediately bring them under control. Problem with that naive view is, well, four things that I've listed on this slide. First of all, that epidemic outcomes actually improved in many societies long before the 1870s. So there must have been some other way. And in fact, in 2020, we devised a new phrase for it, non-pharmaceutical interventions. So obviously, in the Black Death, they didn't call them non-pharmaceutical interventions, but that was what they were doing. And societies have been doing non-pharmaceutical interventions vis-a-vis pandemics for, nearly 7 centuries. The second stylized fact that I think we need to explain and address is that epidemic outcomes varied across societies both before and after the 1870s. So there was a lot of social variation. This was bad for those societies where epidemics were not being dealt well with, but it's wonderful for us as social scientists in a purely neutral sense, because it's a lab. It's a way in which we can test hypotheses about what works and what doesn't. Many societies sadly failed to adopt scientific medicine after the 1870s. And I think, as we saw in 2020, there were even advanced societies which were less or more receptive to the findings of scientific medicine, not just to vaccination, but to the idea that COVID was caused through aerosols, that there might be ways of dealing with that even before you have vaccines. So many societies, there are characteristics of societies which are unreceptive to scientific medicine. This, of course, happened over the centuries before 2020, but it also happened in 2020. So what is it that makes a society or makes its institutions unreceptive to science and medicine? And finally, of course, science and innovations, they're what we would call endogenous. They come out of society. Science and medicine come from somewhere, and more of them come out of certain institutional frameworks than others. And therefore, if we can understand a little bit more about those social institutional frameworks that were more fruitful or more receptive to scientific and medical innovations in past pandemics, maybe it will help us to understand a little bit more why there's variation nowadays. So those were the things that I went in, the sort of stylized facts that I went in trying to address. Epidemic outcomes, as I've mentioned, varied, and this table on this slide is just an example of some of them. I took a bunch out because I didn't want to clutter the slide. But in the book, I talk about a lot of the ways in which epidemic outcomes varied. In the century and a half or 2 centuries after the Black Death, the Western Mediterranean, especially central and northern Italy, especially Florence, was right in the forefront of developing ways of dealing with the recurrent plagues that came after the Black Death. The Eastern Mediterranean was comparatively bad, but so too were those societies which we tend to think, ultimately became the first societies to industrialize. They were very rich in the early modern period. England, the Dutch Republic, Northwest Europe was really backward in dealing with pandemics in the couple of centuries after the Black Death. So really, Northwest Europe was as bad as the Ottoman Empire at managing the interface between human populations and microbial ones in the late medieval period. In the period between 1500 and 1600, again, central and northern Italy in the forefront, northwestern and central Europe way behind. We know that both because of the medical outcome, the mortality outcomes, but also because by then people were traveling around enough. And so you have all of these travel writers from England in the 16th century saying, I've just been to Italy, and they have all these different ways of dealing with plague, and they have health boards, and they have quarantines, and they have lockdowns, and they have furlough payments, and all of these things which we would recognize from 2020. They were already being done in 16th century Italy, but they were a complete revelation to people, travelers from England and travelers from Northwest Europe. Moving on quickly, there was a great reversal after about 1600. So in the 17th century, what we actually find is that the Mediterranean world, which has been dealing with plague really well in the medieval and early modern period, falls behind. And there's something which Northwest Europe begins to do, which means that the mortality outcomes begin to surpass the Mediterranean world. So what is that? Why do you get this great reversal of fortune, or at least reversal of epidemiological fortune? 17th century, as I said, smallpox began to overtake plague in Europe at least, but there were places which were already managing smallpox really well, like Han China, Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, Northern India, all had these commercial variolators. They had these immunization procedures. They understood about social distancing on smallpox. It took Europe a long time. It even took parts of Asia a long time to learn from one another. North America, Southern India, Europe didn't really understand smallpox and had to learn from other parts of the globe at that time. Plague then is still there, is kind of lurking on the outskirts of Europe, and the Austrian Habsburgs actually have something that they call the Militärgrenze, so the military frontier against the Ottoman Empire, but actually it's also an epidemiological frontier. It's how you kept plague out of Western Europe. Smallpox, again, you've got even in different bits of southern Germany in the 19th century. So there are two small territories in southern Germany, which are very beloved by me, since my doctoral work was on one of them, Württemberg, and Felix Schaff and I are actually doing some research still on Württemberg. I will never leave Württemberg behind. But so it was a Protestant, very strongly pietistical Lutheran territory. The next door territory was really similar, but Catholic. It's called Baden. They had completely different smallpox outcomes in the 19th century. And trying to explain why these two South German states, where you just wouldn't think they were that different. I mean, obviously, I think they thought they were different, and they were different, but why did they have such different smallpox outcomes in the 19th century, which is the time when you even had vaccination? And it was the receptiveness to vaccination by all different parts of the institutional framework. Cholera in the 19th century, even different parts of the United States were more or less receptive to ways of controlling cholera. And then finally, the Spanish flu in 1918 to 19 varied a lot between different parts of Europe, different parts of the world, even between Eastern and Western India. So we've got a lot of interesting variation. Severity of the same pandemic differing across societies at the same time. We've got differing across time in the same societies. We've got overall improvement of outcomes between 1346 and 2021, but why? So I'm going to try to answer some of those questions. Actually, first, I wanted to show you a very striking bar chart, which is not mine. It comes from Guido Alfani, but it's an example of how you got these significant differences in outcomes across of the same pandemic within well, as a Canadian, I think I'm allowed to say that Europe is a very small continent. And, you know, within Europe, there was enormous variation among societies in how the 17th century plagues worked out. The intensity of plague intensity calculated as the cumulative number of plague victims throughout the 17th century as a percentage of the population of that society in 1600. There were no discernible differences in plague mortality during the Black Death. But by the 17th century, you had these huge gaps opening up. By then, it was the highest plague intensity was actually in Italy, which had been super successful in the medieval period in controlling plague. So exactly the part of Europe that had achieved lowest plague mortality in the preceding 250 years, remarkably low in England at 9% and France at about 13%, which compares to their very high mortality in the post Black Death pandemics. Other societies kind of in the middle, so Southern Germany, Dutch Republic, Spain, lying sort of around 20%. Why? Why had these huge gaps opened up in this very small continent between 1350 and 1600? Well, that made me think perhaps the organization of society has an effect on epidemic outcomes. Variation in epidemic outcomes across societies suggests that characteristics of society might matter. But the question is on what characteristics? And that led me to my old obsession, which I've been paying attention to since I was a doctoral student in the 1980s, which was that I don't think institutions are the only things that matter for outcomes, whether it's for proto-industrialization or women's position in society or the way that long-distance trade works or the way that human capital investment and so on were all of the big projects I've done. But institutions do play a big role. And they're defined, as I think Raffaele said, as the rules of the game in society, the humanly devised constraints that shape human interaction. That's Doug North's definition. And I think his work on institutions is one of the big reasons why he won the Nobel Prize in Economics back in the 1990s. So there's systems of rules and practices governing how we interact in society. Examples would be the market is an institution. It's not just a place. It's not just a location. It's actually a set of rules and procedures and practices and customs by which we engage in voluntary exchange. The state would be an institution. The local community is an institution. Religion, of course, is a set of beliefs, but it's also a set of worldly practices. It's a set of ways in which we interact with unobservable beings and with each other when we try to please or avoid the wrath of unobservable beings. Guilds, professional associations, we'll talk about them in a few minutes. And the family. The family is one of the basic institutions of society, and it works differently in different societies. It doesn't take the same form in even in different European societies, let alone in different world societies. So the way that economists think about institutions is that they reduce transaction costs. They reduce our costs of agreeing and coordinating with one another to tackle economic problems, but actually also epidemiological problems. They facilitate coordination. We can achieve more working together than we can as individuals. More does not necessarily mean better. So sometimes we can achieve more in a bad way by working together. So I think war might be an example where we all work together. An institution, the state usually helps us, sometimes religion, helps us to work together to wage war. And that can have bad outcomes, not just for the economy, but also, as we'll see, for epidemics. So I don't want to pre-guess institutions and say, oh yeah, it always works out well, they're efficient, that's why we develop them. They just help us coordinate. But the problem is they might help us coordinate bad things. They can coordinate harmful interactions, and they may be captured by powerful elites rather than serving the whole society. And that's one of the lessons from history, I think, that comes out of looking at the way in which institutions interact with epidemics, just as it is when we look at how institutions interact with the economy. Now, I said that I thought that very simple basic economics can help us think more clearly and analytically about epidemics and the way societies deal with them. And the reason for that is that economics has developed a set of tools for thinking about situations, especially situations involving what economics calls externalities, which are spillover costs or spillover benefits that result from my doing something where I don't incur the entire cost of my actions, or I don't enjoy all the benefits of my actions. So to put it in the context of an epidemic, if my getting a disease imposes costs on other people, society would like me to do less of it than I would do if I were acting completely selfishly. Similarly, if my observing social distancing or wearing a face mask or getting vaccinated creates benefits for others on top of the benefits it creates for me. So it creates a benefit for me because I don't get COVID, but it also creates benefits for others because I don't give my COVID to other people. Society would like me to do more of it than I would if I were behaving entirely selfishly. So I remember walking around during COVID, beginning to write this book and thinking, I'm like a little factory that's generating pollution. I'm generating COVID pollution wherever I go. It was a strange way. It was one of the ways in which, I'm sure you've all experienced it, where something you're thinking about very intensely in your academic life actually makes you see your own life and your interaction with society very differently. Thinking of myself as a little COVID generating factory it did take me aback a little bit. So there's the question of negative externalities. When I work or I shop or I socialize while infected, I cause contagion costs beyond those that I suffer myself. Similarly, if I act hygienically, if I get immunized, if I wear a face mask, I generate benefits. So I'm a little factory creating benefits, which was a slightly nicer thought, beyond the ones that I myself enjoy. So society would like me to do more of those good things. On top of that, economics has a whole set of tools for thinking about what economists call public goods, which are good things or goods and services, which are what we call non-rival and non-excludable. And a really good example is information, and that's important both for economies, but also for how we deal with disease. Because when information is a public good, it has very strong public good characteristics because it's non-rival in the sense that my consumption of a piece of information doesn't prevent you from consuming it. And similarly, it's not excludable. So you can often consume a fact even if you haven't paid for it. Now, of course, there are forms of information that can be made rival and can be made excludable. So there's seldom a perfect public good, but it has very strong public good characteristics. And there are other public goods like sanitary systems or innovations where, yes, you can kind of make some of the benefits appropriable to particular individuals or organizations, but actually it has these really strong public good characteristics. So information, because I find it hard to get anyone to pay me for information, I'll produce and diffuse less of it than would benefit society at large. And that's why it's good that the University of Oxford pays my salary, because I produce information and I benefit, but I also diffuse it. So, I don't need to get someone to pay me to write my books or talk here. I can just come and give it for free. It may not be as useful as some of, inventing vaccination, but we can't all be Edward Jenner. So I do, I produce economic history. But it's, we have institutions that enable us to reward people, scientists, for producing new ideas because they often can't appropriate the benefits of those ideas because ideas are public goods. So there are these really useful, very basic concepts in economics. It's not rocket science. It's not the really super techie stuff that you can do also using those concepts. It's kind of basic ways of reasoning that I think help us understand the way in which epidemics work and kind of can sort out some of the debates that we had during COVID about, well, it's a matter of personal choice what I do. Yes, it is a matter of personal choice, but if you're a little COVID producing factory, then it's also something which is producing pollution for everybody else. So Controlling Contagion, the book, which should be out in the winter, it slides a little bit, so it may be early 2025 rather than in time for Christmas 2024, but it's going to be out around then. What I do in the book is I analyze each major institution of human societies in turn. So I look at the market, I look at the state, I look at the local community, I look at religion, I look at medical associations and medical guilds, so professional associations, and the relevant ones for us are the medical ones. And I look at the family. And what I find, the good news is that since the Black Death, probably before, but the evidence is really terrible before the Black Death, each of those core institutions of human societies really did help us control epidemics, mainly in four main ways, through sanitation, through social distancing, through information provision like disease notification systems, like, Florence gets told by Milan, the plague is coming your way. Set up a quarantine system, guard your borders. This was happening by the 15th century here. Information provision and innovation, which is, of course, a kind of information provision, but innovating new practices, either pharmaceutical or non-pharmaceutical interventions. So the state tended to use coercion. That's the good and the bad thing about the state, to internalize those externalities that I was talking about and to provide public goods. The local community, its unique selling point is social capital. It's really good at fostering a social capital of shared norms and information transmission and collective action and collective sanctions. And local communities did foster the social capital that enabled them to monitor good and bad behavior and reward it, at least informally, or punish it informally. Religion supplied moral suasion and theological exhortation. Don't infect your neighbor. Think about others. Medical associations provided professional expertise, quality control on medical provision. The family fostered the emotional bonds that actually make us care, at least about our fellow family members, safeguard their own vulnerable members. And by trying to safeguard your own vulnerable family members, it may lead you to the family to put pressure on the outside world to people outside their families to behave in ways that are safe. one nice example is a piece of fieldwork that was done in rural Poland in 2020, where families put in supermarkets, a mother would go up and say, put your face mask on, you'll infect my child. So there are ways in which by trying to protect your children, you actually try to enforce the way in which other people behave. And markets, even though epidemics involve market failures, they also have a good side. They increased incomes. Markets are very strongly associated with economic growth, both cross-sectionally and down the long span of human history. Economic growth increased individual incomes, giving people more resources to invest in protecting themselves from pandemics. As soon as you protect yourself from pandemics, you're also protecting everyone else because you're not being a little COVID factory. And also, the other thing about economic growth is that it massively increases fiscal capacity. Controlling a pandemic is really expensive. We learned that in 2020. If you've got a rich society, that people can pay higher taxes, they will make more philanthropic donations, they will donate to religion, and when the state or philanthropic organizations or religions are actually investing in contagion control, that means a rich society will tend to do better. And if you look at the mortality statistics down the ages, the outcomes were better in rich societies, and they still are now. So don't neglect markets. Markets fail, we have to deal with externalities, but markets also on average, make a society rich enough to invest in both individual and collective measures. So the good news is that all of these institutions did good things. You can observe it happening. And, it's a 600-page book, and I hope that some of you will read some of the 600 pages. But on the other hand, I didn't want to just look at the bright side. Every institution also showed very clearly, and even shows nowadays, that it had weaknesses and malignancies. And I can't talk about all of them now, but I'm going to just go quickly through some of the major ones. State capacity. States provided public goods, they enforced sanitation, they enforced social distancing, they did amazing things, and well-functioning states played a really big role in contagion control from Florence in the late medieval period straight down to probably Florence after a bit in 2020. But the other thing to realize about the state is that before about the 1930s, most states used something between 80 and 90% of their revenues for war. And there is so much evidence that war was a big trigger of pandemics. Plague, smallpox, cholera, influenza, visibly, observably spread by the 100 Years' War, by the Columbian Exchange, by the 30 Years' War, by the Franco-Prussian War, by World War I, and indeed in Syria in 2020, where the Syrian civil war was worst, COVID outcomes were also worse. War is terrible from an epidemiological point of view. In fact, more people die of epidemics in war than actually die from being killed in violence as a general rule. It isn't just that the state spent until the 1930s most of its revenues on war, but the state also did other things. The state was not primarily in business to stop epidemics. So to serve its military and political purposes, states often weakened travel inspections, quarantines, and isolation. They falsified information. Thank you. I have a nice example, again, from Italy, not because I'm speaking in Italy, but because so much of the wonderful evidence from the past actually comes from Italian archives. Carl Emanuel I of Savoy in 1598, he successfully ordered the concealment of a terrible plague in Torino, and forced the merchants of his city to attend the trade fair in Asti, quote, in order to obtain from them the taxes he usually gets at the fair. So he knew, and his officials knew, that there was a terrible plague going on in his city, but he said, conceal this. I need the Turin merchants to go to the fair of Asti to trade there, because that's where my fiscal capacity comes from. So concealing evidence of epidemics for fiscal reasons. It also happened in World War I, just in case you thought, oh, well, you know, it's back in the 16th century. We don't do that nowadays. I wouldn't be surprised if we did it nowadays. We certainly did it 100 years ago. In turn for political support, states often granted religions and guilds, professional associations, a veto over contagion measures, over medical innovations. We'll talk about those in a moment when we look at immunization. And also to facilitate their control, social control over other spheres of human activity, governments imposed really authoritarian measures that were bad in themselves, in the sense that many governments, I mean, just to give one example, many governments up until the 18th century, and even in some parts of the world into the early 20th century, for some reason had the view that women were particularly infective. So there were gender-specific lockdowns. Or you kick all the women out of Chinese villages in 1910 because their moist humors are, you know, spread plague. So specific target scapegoats tended to get subjected to much more social control, not because they were actually causing epidemics, but because it was a good way of controlling them anyway. Or, you know, women wearing cosmetics and fancy dress had brought God's wrath down on the city. And so you have to lock up women in order that God will kind of take the plague away. So, you know, there's a lot of facilitated control over other activities by way of imposing contagion controls. And I did mention earlier cross-border externalities. The problem is that plague does not, whatever plague it is, COVID, influenza, smallpox, plague, does not stop at international borders. So, and the problem is that often individual states don't really care about what happens to citizens of other countries. So from providing information, the Carl Emmanuel of Savoy didn't really care what happened in Asti. He just cared about his own fiscal intake. Many states don't care so much about what goes on outside their borders. Immunization, there are examples of vaccine diplomacy reaching right back. As soon as vaccination was invented, you have states engaging in vaccine diplomacy, but there's also a tendency, even nowadays, to not put enough resources into that, even though actually stopping COVID elsewhere in the world will be good for us. Or stopping smallpox elsewhere in the world in the 19th century was good for Europe. Migration is another example. And then there's the whole question of river-borne diseases, whether it's the Danube carrying diseases downstream in the 19th century or the Ganges doing it nowadays with COVID infections. What about communal social capital? Well, local communities did do good things. They fostered norms, information, sanctions, collective action, but often local communities were too informal to actually be able to achieve very much. The other thing about local communities is that they can function as echo chambers. And that was one of the reasons that actually accounted for the Württemberg bad smallpox outcomes, was that these little Württemberg communities got together and, you know that vaccination causes you to turn into a cow and, it will kill your children. So the communities can go, in good directions or bad directions. And sadly, in history, we actually see communities fostering anti-vax sentiment or fostering sort of anti-social distancing riots. The other thing communities do is that they persecute scapegoats. And a lot of the pogroms against Jews in Europe that happened during the Black Death and during later plague pandemics actually were fomented on the level of the local community. It was actually the state and even religion that were trying to calm communities down, but the community would, a mob would go in and burn the ghetto. So a lot of these programs were actually informal things that boiled up out of these echo chambers of communities. And the other, I mean, a nice example actually comes from Prato, near here. In 1630, Prato had a lazaretto, a pest house in which social people were isolated if they got plague. But they didn't let villagers from the surrounding countryside into the lazaretto. And it took the Grand Duke of Tuscany to tell them, look, by eradicating disease outside the town walls, its eradication within is made easier. So the problem with local communities is that they are local. They may not care about what goes on outside the walls, even though it would actually benefit themselves. Because we have so little time, I'm not going to try to answer what is God's will. I think I will just observe that we know that religions can preach that you should love your neighbor and not give him plague or COVID, but religions can also say you have to come to church even if there is plague going on. Or the Württemberg clergy in the 19th century can say God does not want you to be vaccinated. Your body is a temple, and God does not want you to interfere with what is in that temple. So again, religion can go in good directions or in bad ones. And finally, there's the question of professional associations, because the quotation at the top of this slide, we look after doctors so they can look after you, is actually from the British Medical Association. It's on their website. But it's very much what medical guilds in the past said was, by giving us exclusive privileges over medicine, you will actually benefit society at large, the common weal. And this did happen sometimes, but sometimes it didn't. Professional associations had a monopoly, so they restricted medical provision. If there was a plague on, they would tend to withdraw from the market, and they wouldn't let substitutes, non-guild members, come in and provide medical provision. They're not incorruptible. So they would issue, to please governments or to please business, they would, in Padua in 1577, in Milan in 1627, there is no question of plague, just when plague was coming in. But the business interests and the state interests had kind of put pressure on the medical association not to cause panic. I want to give you a picture now, because I've been talking for a while, of guilds and Swedish smallpox, because we tend to think cities were places where more vaccination happened. But in 19th century Sweden, it was actually the other way around. The amount of vaccination that took place was lowest in Stockholm and much higher in the countryside. The reason that doesn't come out of my research, it comes out of a Swedish researcher's 600-page book back in the 1990s. The reason that it was better in the countryside, higher vaccinations in the countryside than in the town, was that in the town, medical association had a monopoly over vaccination. In countryside, any person who got a certificate of competence could do it. And the cost of getting vaccinated was much higher in Stockholm, and the availability was much lower. And as a consequence, you can see on the graph, the dotted line is the countryside, and rich Stockholm has a much lower vaccination rate. Okay, I hope I've established, and I will talk very quickly, I will wrap up some conclusions over the next couple of minutes. I hope I've established that every institution had a dark side, it had strengths, but it also had weaknesses, which disabled it from being able to deal with particular things. And sometimes it had malignancies. Sometimes an institution could seek its own interests or could be captured by a particular elite group and seek their interests and not serve society at large. And so the question is, what is it that made the difference? What decided whether the good or the bad side came out on top? And the conclusion that I come to at the end of the book was that it wasn't any single institution. So it wasn't, oh, you want to have a lot of state capacity, or, free markets at all costs, or, it needs to be informed by religion, or you mustn't have any religion at all. It wasn't a single institution. It was the way the wider institutional framework worked, the entire institutional framework. Each institution needed help from others to deploy its strengths, and each had weaknesses that others could compensate for, or even malignancies that others could curb. So it was the framework in general, not a single, there wasn't a magic pill, unfortunately. What tends to come out of economic history at any rate is it's complicated. There's a lot going on. And certainly in this case, that's the case. So what, in conclusion, what can we say about the features, the general features of the good frameworks? Well, I think there were 4 that come out of the last 700 years of epidemic history. The first is heterogeneity, a variegated ecosystem of institutions with diverse strengths and weaknesses. Epidemics are complicated. Secondly, a state, but a temperate state. You need a state. The state needs to have the coercive power to remedy externalities, provide public goods, control special interest groups, but there needs to be curbs on the state's power to limit especially warfare, but also authoritarian excess. The third thing is, it's strange to say this because we started out by looking at market failures, but you actually do need a reasonably well-functioning market. Facilitating economic growth, generating resources for each of us individually to invest in epidemic control, but also fiscal capacity for the state, donations to charity, donations to science. And finally, in a way, the fourth one is restating the first one, a vigorous civil society. We need assistance and countervailing pressures from non-state, non-market institutions to keep the state and the market and us honest. Okay, what are we really then talking about when we think about the way in which human institutions interact with microbes? Well, between the Black Death and COVID, we have a situation in which epidemic risks declined hugely, not mainly because of science and medicine, only really after the 1870s, and sadly, not completely, even in 2020. Rather, it was because this huge decrease in epidemic contagion was because of institutional clusters or frameworks that helped human societies learn and helped human societies innovate. And it wasn't just scientific and medical learning, it was social learning. We needed to be able to innovate in order to devise forms of social distancing, of sanitation and immunization that worked with rather than against human incentives, individual incentives. And we needed to coordinate. We needed to mediate among diverse interests in society in order to persuade individuals and organizations actually to adopt anti-contagion innovations. And I think we all sadly observed that that mediation is good in better in some societies than others. We observed it a few years ago, and I think sadly we'll probably observe it again. So I'd like to end with a quotation from a US doctor in 1918 who wrote that influenza had been a destroyer, but also a teacher. Because are there lessons from history? Is it possible to have societal learning? Well, I think the last 700 years actually show that it is possible. It's not inevitable, but it's possible to have societal learning because there were societies that learned to not just to deal with lethal microbes, but also to control malignant institutions. That learning has not been perfect, but on the other hand, the epidemic risks nowadays are much lower than in 1350. COVID was awful, but it wasn't anything like as bad as the Black Death or even as bad as the 1918 to 19 flu. I think that the last 700 years of history suggest that there were 4 big steps in societal learning. That institutional diversity I talked about, the temperate state, the well-functioning market, and that vigorous civil society that keeps those other institutions honest. Institutional clusters with those features emerge from the book as having made it possible for people to innovate and coordinate, addressing not just the scientific and medical side of epidemics, but the social challenges inside our own societies of controlling epidemic contagion. Thank you very much.